June 2nd, 1945. 3:17 p.m. Dover Harbor, Kent, England. Salt spray misted across the concrete pier as gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the rumble of diesel engines. Ilse Richter stepped off the gangway onto British soil and felt her legs nearly give out. Not from weakness, though 2 weeks in transport had left her skeletal, but from the electric certainty that this pier would be the last solid ground she'd ever touch. The gray channel water lapped against pilings 20 feet below. Easy enough, she thought, to line prisoners along this edge and solve the problem of housing them with a single efficient volley. She was 31 years old. She'd been a postal clerk in Dresden before conscription into the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, Signals Auxiliary, in 1943. The uniform she wore hung loose, sized for a woman who'd existed before starvation became routine. Her hands, zip-tied at the wrists, had gone numb an hour ago. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore, only the plastic cutting into swollen flesh. Beside her, Greta Zimmermann whispered in German, "This is it. This is where they do it." Her voice carried no hysteria, just flat acceptance. Greta was 26, from Munich, had worked meteorological calculations. She'd watched Soviet soldiers execute her commanding officer in April. She knew what the end looked like. 37 German women stood on Dover Pier that June afternoon, arranged in uneven rows by British soldiers who'd shouted instructions none of them fully understood. The wind cut through their thin uniforms, carrying the smell of fish and diesel and something else. Bread baking somewhere nearby, absurdly normal. Ilse's eyes tracked the soldiers' movements, looking for the one who would give the signal, looking for rifles being unslung from shoulders, looking for the moment that would justify 12 years of warnings about what happened to Germans who fell into enemy hands. If this makes you question everything you thought you knew, you're paying attention. Subscribe now. These stories deserve to be heard. For the entirety of Ilse's adult life, the threat of Allied brutality had been background radiation, constant and invisible until you measured for it. The Ministry of Propaganda had been explicit. British forces showed no mercy to captured Germans. Execution was standard. For women, treatment before execution would be worse. Systematic violation. Torture for intelligence they didn't possess. Death as afterthought, rather than mercy. These weren't abstract warnings. They were detailed, specific, reinforced through every channel the Reich controlled. Newsreels showed alleged British atrocities, bodies in ditches, burned villages, testimonies from German soldiers who'd supposedly witnessed summary executions. Whether footage was authentic or manufactured became irrelevant by 1945. The message had saturated deep enough to become instinct. Ilse had attended mandatory briefings in March 1945 as the Wehrmacht collapsed and Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. An officer whose name she'd forgotten delivered the presentation. Capture means death. The British execute prisoners or work them to death in camps. Soviet treatment is worse, but British are nearly as savage. If you cannot fight, if you cannot escape, make the end quick yourself. He distributed cyanide capsules to Signals personnel considered security risks. Women who'd handled encryption, who knew code procedures, who might be interrogated. Ilse received hers on March 14th. She'd carried it in her left breast pocket for 6 weeks before British soldiers confiscated it during capture on April 29th. The soldier who'd found it, young Scottish accent thick enough to be incomprehensible, had held the capsule up to the light, shaken his head, and dropped it in a collection tin with dozens of others. The capture itself had been anticlimactic. Ilse's unit, stationed in a requisitioned schoolhouse outside Bremen, had been surrounded by elements of the British XXX Corps on April 29th at approximately 09:30 hours. They'd burned codebooks, smashed encryption equipment, destroyed anything that might constitute intelligence value. Then they'd waited. Some prayed, others cried quietly. Greta had simply sat against the wall, hands folded, face blank. The British soldiers who'd entered had been professional, almost bored. They'd searched for weapons, found none, and zip-tied wrists with plastic strips that tightened with each movement. Then transport, lorries to a temporary holding facility, warehouse space with concrete floors where they'd spent 3 days with no information. Then trucks to an airfield, then a cargo plane that smelled of oil and metal, then a ship crossing the channel while women vomited into buckets and prayed and waited for whatever came next. Now, standing on Dover Pier, Ilsa understood that next had arrived. The British officer approaching wore the insignia of a captain, dress uniform crisp despite the damp air. He was 40-something, lean, with dark hair graying at the temples and a face that revealed nothing. Captain James Whitmore, she'd learn later. He carried a clipboard and walked with the measured pace of someone conducting routine business. He stopped 10 feet from the first row of prisoners and spoke in English. His voice was clear, precise, upper-class accent that made even incomprehensible words sound authoritative. He gestured toward the trucks idling at the far end of the pier. He pointed toward the road leading inland. He looked at his clipboard, then at the women, then back at the clipboard. No rifles appeared. No soldiers formed firing lines. Whitmore simply nodded to the sergeant beside him, a heavy-set man in his 50s with sergeant's stripes and an expression of professional patience, and walked back toward the trucks. Sergeant Arthur Brennan stepped forward. He was Manchester-born, Ilsa would learn, had spent 3 years in North Africa before transfer to prisoner processing. His face was weathered, creased from sun and wind, and too many cigarettes, but his eyes were steady. He made eye contact with each woman, a slow scan down the rows, then spoke in slow, careful English. "You will board the trucks. You will be taken to a processing facility. You will be registered, searched, and assigned quarters. You will receive food and water. No one will harm you. Do you understand?" Silence. Not because they understood, because fear had calcified into something beyond speech. Brennan switched to broken German, cobbled from months of processing prisoners. "Last Wagen. Food. Wasser. Kein. Hurt." He gestured toward the trucks, then mimed eating, drinking. "Safe. Verstehen?" Still silence. Ilsa's mind struggled to process the disconnect between expectation and these words. Safe. A British sergeant was promising safety. The logical gymnastics required to reconcile that promise with 12 years of propaganda exceeded her capacity in that moment. Her breath came shallow, quick. Her vision tunneled. Greta spoke, voice barely audible. "He's lying. Get us calm before—" "He's not lying," another voice interrupted. Frieda Vogel, 42, former schoolteacher from Hamburg, educated enough to understand English better than most. "He said we'll receive food and water. He said no one will harm us." "They'd say that anyway," Greta insisted. "Get us docile." Brennan had been watching this exchange, not understanding the words, but reading the tension. He sighed, reached into his jacket pocket, and withdrew a dented tin mug. He walked to a water barrel secured to the pier, drinking water for dock workers, filled the mug, and approached Ilsa. She was closest. He held out the mug. Ilsa stared at it. The mug was old, military issue, with a rolled rim and faint WD stamp for War Department. Brennan's hands were clean, nails trimmed, no blood under them. The water in the mug was clear, slightly cloudy from minerals but not from contamination. He wasn't holding the mug mockingly or as trap. He was offering water to a woman who hadn't drunk anything but tepid ship's rations for 2 days. She couldn't take it. Her hands were still zip-tied. Brennan seemed to realize this simultaneously. He set the mug on the concrete, withdrew a knife from his belt. Several women gasped, and cut Ilsa's zip tie with one quick motion. The plastic fell away. Blood rushed into her hands, painful and overwhelming. Brennan picked up the mug and offered it again. Ilsa took it. The metal was cool against her palms. She raised it to her lips, hesitated, still half convinced this was poisoned or some elaborate psychological torture, then drank. The water tasted of tin and minerals, and was the best thing she'd experienced in weeks. She drank the entire mug in 4 swallows, water spilling down her chin. Brennan waited until she finished, took the mug back, refilled it, and handed it to Greta. Then he moved down the line, cutting zip ties and offering water. Each woman drank. Some wept while drinking. Others remained stone-faced, unable to process kindness as anything but prelude to cruelty. When all 37 women had been given water and freed from restraints, Brennan returned to his position. "The trucks," he said, pointing. "Now, please." They walked. Not marched, walked at their own pace, unescorted except by Brennan and two younger soldiers who maintained distance rather than proximity. The trucks were canvas-covered lorries with wooden benches, uncomfortable, but not deliberately cruel. Women climbed in, arranged themselves, sat in silence punctuated only by the engine starting and the lurch of movement. The drive lasted 40 minutes, winding through Kent countryside that looked impossibly green after months in cities reduced to rubble. Fields with actual crops growing, villages with intact buildings, civilians going about ordinary life, shopping, walking, talking. No bomb craters, no burned-out vehicles, no bodies. The contrast was disorienting. This was enemy territory, but it looked like peace. The processing facility was a converted estate, Georgian manor house surrounded by outbuildings that had been adapted for military use. The truck stopped in a courtyard paved with gravel. Brennan opened the back of each lorry personally, offering his hand to help women down. Ilsa took it automatically, felt his grip, firm but not crushing, simply functional assistance. Her feet touched gravel, and she looked up at the manor house. 3 stories of pale stone with intact windows and chimneys producing actual smoke. Someone was heating the building. In June. For prisoners. Processing occurred in the manor's former ballroom, now divided by tables and hanging curtains into stations. Each woman passed through in sequence: registration, medical examination, property collection, quarter assignment. The staff were mixed: British soldiers and WAC officers, Red Cross personnel, even a translator who spoke German with a Swiss accent. Lieutenant Sarah Hastings conducted Ilsa's registration. She was 30, efficient, with red hair pinned in victory rolls and an expression of professional neutrality. She asked questions in careful German: name, rank, unit, next of kin. Ilsa answered mechanically, still waiting for the trap to spring. Hastings wrote responses on a form, checked boxes, stamped something official-looking. "You'll be in quarters with 5 others," Hastings said. "Female guards only in the dormitory building. Male guards in common areas. If you have problems, report to the wardress. Understand?" Ilsa nodded. Hastings studied her for a moment. "You look terrified. That's normal. But I promise, no one here will hurt you. That's not what we do." She slid a pamphlet across the table. "Geneva Convention. Read it if you can. You have rights here." The medical examination was conducted by Dr. Patricia Morrison, 48, calm and thorough. She checked for communicable diseases, malnutrition symptoms, injuries requiring treatment. Her touch was impersonal but gentle, hands warm through the thin latex gloves. "You're underweight," she said through the translator. "Not critically, but we'll adjust your rations. Any pain? Dizziness? Nausea?" Ilsa shook her head to each question, though dizziness was constant from hunger and stress. Morrison made notes. "You'll receive a full meal this evening. Try to eat slowly. Your stomach needs time to adjust. If you experience discomfort, report to the medical officer immediately." Property collection was simpler. Ilsa had nothing except the clothes she wore and a small cloth bag containing a comb, a handkerchief, and a letter from her mother dated March 1945. The soldier inventorying possessions, Private Henry Webb, 19, too young to have seen much combat, handled each item carefully, writing descriptions, placing them in a canvas sack labeled with her name. "You'll get these back when you leave," he said through the translator. "We're not thieves." Quarter assignment came last. Ilsa was directed to Dormitory C, Room 4, along with 5 other women including Greta and Frida. They walked across the courtyard, supervised by Women's Auxiliary Corps officer Helen Clark, who moved at a pace that accommodated exhaustion rather than enforcing military precision. Dormitory C had been the estate's carriage house, converted into living quarters with rooms branching off a central corridor. Room 4 was small, maybe 15 feet by 12, with 3 bunk beds, a single window, and a coal stove in the corner. Blankets were piled on each bed, coarse wool that smelled of mothballs and laundry soap. The floor was wood, swept clean. The walls were whitewashed. Clark showed them the lavatory at the corridor's end. Actual plumbing, sinks with running water, toilets that flushed. Hot water between 06 naum and 08 wound, and again 18 naum to 20 naum, she explained. Cold water always available. WAR2 station is at the building entrance if you need anything. She handed Frida, who seemed the most composed, a printed schedule. Meals, work assignments, everything's listed. Questions? No one had questions. Questions required cognitive capacity they'd exhausted hours ago. Clark nodded, understanding without explanation needed. Dinner's at 18, so someone will knock to escort you to the mess. Rest until then. She left, closing the door but not locking it. The 6 women stood in their assigned room, staring at bunks and blankets, and the window that showed evening light beginning to fade. No one moved. Moving would make this real, and none of them were ready for that acknowledgement. Finally, Greta sat on the lower bunk nearest the door. "This is the waiting," she said quietly. "They're making us comfortable before—" "Before what?" Frida interrupted, voice sharp with exhaustion. "Before they feed us, house us, give us blankets? What kind of torture involves plumbing?" "Psychological," Greta insisted. "Break us down with kindness. Extract information." "We don't have information worth extracting," Ilsa said. Her voice surprised her, steadier than she'd expected. "The war's over. Germany's divided. Whatever codes we knew are obsolete. There's nothing to extract." Greta had no response to that logic. She lay down on the bunk, facing the wall, ending the conversation through withdrawal. Ilsa chose the upper bunk nearest the window. She climbed up, legs shaking from effort, and lay on the bare mattress, staring at whitewashed ceiling. The room smelled of coal dust and soap and old wood. Outside, she heard footsteps on gravel, distant voices speaking English. The ordinary sounds of a functioning facility. No screams. No gunfire. No evidence of the atrocities she'd been prepared to experience. The knock came at 17:55. A young WAC officer, Corporal Beth Williams, cheerful and entirely too energetic, opened the door. "Dinner time, ladies. Follow me, please." The mess hall occupied the manor's former dining room, long tables arranged in rows with benches on either side. British staff ate at tables near the front. Prisoners ate at tables in the back, separated not by barriers but by unspoken arrangement. The room was warm, heated by radiators that hissed gently. Windows were tall, letting in the last of daylight. Ilsa got in line with the others, received a tray from a bored-looking private, and moved down the serving line. A woman in kitchen whites, civilian, not military, ladled soup into a bowl on Ilsa's tray. Thick soup, brown with beef broth, vegetables visible. Another woman added 2 slices of bread, actual wheat bread with a crust. Another added a mug of tea, steam rising. Ilsa carried her tray to an empty table and sat. The soup's smell made her stomach cramp with hunger so intense it bordered on nausea. She picked up the spoon. Metal, real silverware, not the wooden implements she'd expected. And tasted. The soup was hot, savory, rich with flavors she'd almost forgotten existed. She ate slowly, each spoonful deliberate, aware that eating too fast after prolonged hunger caused vomiting. The bread was fresh, still warm from baking. The tea was strong, bitter without sugar, but drinkable. Around her, other women ate with the same careful deliberation. Some cried quietly while eating, tears mixing with soup. Others ate mechanically, faces blank. Frida ate half her portion, then wrapped the bread in a handkerchief and tucked it into her pocket. Ilsa understood the impulse. Hoard food against future scarcity, but didn't follow it. If this meal was real, perhaps tomorrow's would be too. After dinner, they returned to Dormitory C. Wardress Margaret Flynn, 56, sat at the entrance desk reading a newspaper. She looked up as they passed, nodded politely, returned to reading. No interrogation, no inspection, just acknowledgement that they existed and had returned from dinner. In room 4, the women prepared for sleep. There was discussion about posting a watch, someone to stay awake in case guards came during the night. But exhaustion overruled paranoia. Ilsa climbed into her bunk, pulled the wool blanket up to her chin, and fell asleep within minutes, despite every expectation that she'd lie awake terrified. She woke to morning light through the window and the sound of someone knocking. The door opened before anyone responded. Corporal Williams again, still cheerful. "Morning, ladies. Breakfast in 20 minutes. Wash up if you like. The lavatory was chaos. 6 women trying to use 4 sinks simultaneously. Cold water because the hot water hours hadn't started yet. Ilsa splashed water on her face, shocked by how her reflection looked in the mirror above the sink. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, older than 31, but alive. Demonstrably, frustratingly alive. Breakfast was porridge with milk, toast with margarine, more tea. The same routine as dinner. Line up, receive food, eat at assigned tables, return to quarters. Then, at 8:30, assembly in the courtyard for work assignment. Captain Whitmore addressed them through the translator. You will work. This is required under Geneva Convention protocols. Work will be fair, compensated, and appropriate to your capabilities. You will not be assigned combat-related tasks. You will not be abused or overworked. Refusal to work results in loss of privileges, not punishment. Understand? The translator repeated this in German. The women nodded, still unsure what privileges meant in context of imprisonment. Ilsa's group was assigned to the estate gardens. The head gardener, Mr. Thomas Caldwell, was 67, a civilian retained to maintain the grounds who now supervised prisoner labor. He was Yorkshire-born, spoke no German, and communicated through gestures and demonstration. The work was straightforward. Weeding beds, trimming hedges, planting vegetables in the kitchen garden that supplied the camp. Physical labor after weeks of inactivity was exhausting, but not cruel. Caldwell set a reasonable pace, demonstrated techniques, and stopped them for water breaks every hour. On the second day, during a mid-morning break, Caldwell produced a thermos from his shed and poured tea into the same dented tin mug Sergeant Brennan had used on the pier. He handed it to Ilsa first. She happened to be closest, and gestured for her to drink. The mug was warm, tea inside sweet with sugar. Caldwell must have supplied himself since prisoner rations didn't include luxuries. Ilsa drank, passed the mug to Greta, who drank and passed it to the next woman. The mug circulated through their group, each woman taking small sips until the tea was gone. Caldwell refilled it twice, ensuring everyone had enough. When the break ended, he collected the mug, rinsed it at the garden tap, and returned it to his shed. The gesture was so casual, so devoid of ceremony, that it took Ilsa hours to process its significance. He'd shared his tea with enemy prisoners, as though they were merely workers taking a break rather than dangerous foreigners requiring containment. This wasn't sentiment. It was civilization under pressure. The British approach to prisoner management rested on 4 pillars, though Ilsa wouldn't understand the framework for months. First, security through structure rather than brutality. Prisoners who were fed, housed, and treated fairly were less likely to riot, escape, or cause disruption. Second, intelligence. Content prisoners were more likely to answer questions, reveal useful information, cooperate with interrogators. Third, diplomatic optics. Britain had signed the Geneva Conventions and gained propaganda advantage by actually following them, contrasting themselves with Nazi Germany's documented violations. Fourth, and least discussed but most important, maintaining moral authority. If Britain became the thing it fought against, if British soldiers tortured and executed prisoners, then the war's moral foundation crumbled. Restraint wasn't weakness. It was the thing that separated civilization from barbarism. These policies weren't uniformly applied. Some camps were run by commanders who viewed Geneva protections as inconvenient suggestions. But in facilities administered by professional military personnel who'd internalized these principles through years of training, the standards held. Cruelty was deviation, not norm. Kindness, or at least professional courtesy, was policy. Over the following weeks, Ilsa learned the camp's rhythm through repetition. Wake at 6:30. Wash with hot water if the timing was right, cold if not. Breakfast at 07:00. Work from 08:30 to 12:00. Lunch. Work from 13:30 to 17:00. Dinner. Free time until lights out at 22 biners. The structure was rigid, but not oppressive. Within that framework, small freedoms existed. Choosing where to sit at meals, organizing bunk arrangements, spending evening hours reading books from the camp library, or teaching each other skills. In July, Corporal Williams delivered mail for the first time. 3 letters for Ilse's group, 1 for Frida, 2 for other women. Ilse received nothing, which meant either her mother hadn't written, or the letter hadn't yet navigated the chaos of German postal systems. But the fact that mail was delivered at all, that prisoners could receive correspondence, challenged another propaganda pillar. Prisoners in death camps didn't get mail. Frida's letter was from her sister in Hamburg. She read it aloud to the room that evening, voice breaking on certain passages. The house was gone, bombed in July 1943. Their mother had survived, but was living in a church basement with 40 other displaced persons. Food was scarce. Hamburg was rubble. The British occupation forces were not as bad as feared, but not kind either. Efficient, cold, but they don't shoot civilians for sport. That last phrase hung in the air. Don't shoot civilians for sport. The bar for acceptable behavior had dropped so low that not murdering people for entertainment qualified as positive assessment. Yet here, in this camp, prisoners received mail and tea and work that had purpose. The contrast was destabilizing. If you're beginning to see how deeply propaganda shaped every corner of this war, and how fragile those illusions were, subscribe now. The full picture is always more complicated than the myths. August brought an incident that revealed the system's limits. A guard, Private Douglas Mason, 23, newly assigned from another facility, got frustrated during an evening inspection. One of the women, Kata Schneider, didn't understand his instructions quickly enough. Mason grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her forward, shouting something in English that was clearly profane. Wardress Flynn was across the room. She covered the distance with speed that seemed impossible for a woman her age. "Private Mason," she said, voice like ice. "Step outside. Now." Mason tried to protest. Flynn cut him off. That wasn't a request. The inspection continued without Mason. Flynn returned 10 minutes later, collected the remaining guards, and dismissed the prisoners to their rooms. Ilse never saw Mason again. Greta, whose English had improved through proximity and necessity, reported that he'd been transferred immediately, formal complaint filed, likely facing disciplinary action for conduct unbecoming and violation of prisoner treatment protocols. The message was identical to what Sergeant Turner had demonstrated with Private Collins in the other camp. Cruelty was not tolerated. Guards who couldn't maintain professional standards were removed. The system required discipline, not of prisoners, but of the people with power over prisoners. That distinction mattered. That night, Ilse lay in her bunk, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. The tin mug had reappeared in her thoughts, Caldwell's casual offering of tea, Brennan's offering of water on the pier, both using the same type of military-issue mug. She'd never touched the actual mug since those moments, but the image persisted. Dented metal, rolled rim, slightly bitter tea, simple gestures that said, "You deserve basic dignity. You are human beings, not animals." If the propaganda was lies, and it was demonstrably thoroughly lies, then what else had been false? The racial superiority doctrine that justified the war, the claim that Germany fought defensive battles against aggressors, the narrative that Lebensraum was necessary, that certain peoples were expendable, that the ends justified any means. If British soldiers were decent, and German propaganda painted them as monsters, how much of Germany's self-understanding was built on similar fabrications? Ilse didn't have answers. The questions alone were enough to keep her awake until dawn broke through the window, turning darkness to gray to pale gold. She climbed down from her bunk quietly, not waking the others, and dressed in the plain work clothes provided by the camp. Then she walked to the lavatory, splashed cold water on her face, and looked at her reflection. Same gaunt face, same hollow eyes. But something behind them had shifted. Not hope exactly. More like the first recognition that survival might involve rebuilding everything she thought she knew. In September, Ilse received her first letter from home. Her mother had written it in July. The envelope bore stamps and markings from multiple postal authorities. The letter was brief, handwriting shaky. "We thought you dead. Thank God you're alive. Your father didn't return from the front. We assume the worst. Hamburg is rubble, but we survive. Come home when they release you. We need you. Mama! Ilse read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the cloth bag with her other possessions. The letter's content was devastating. Her father almost certainly dead, her city destroyed, her family reduced to survival mode. But the fact that the letter arrived at all meant the British had established mail protocols, that prisoners could communicate with family, that imprisonment didn't mean isolation from the world. She wrote back the next day, using paper and pencil provided by Corporal Williams. Dear Mama, I am alive and healthy. The camp is not what we were told to expect. I work in gardens. The guards are professional. I receive food and shelter. I don't know when I'll be released, but I am safe. Tell everyone I'm alive. I love you. Ilse. She didn't mention the tea or the bread or the way Caldwell had shown her how to prune roses without damaging next year's growth. Those details felt too intimate, too likely to be misinterpreted as collaboration or Stockholm Syndrome. But she hoped the subtext was clear. The propaganda was wrong. Survival was possible. The enemy wasn't monstrous. Autumn brought expanded work assignments. Prisoners with specific skills were reassigned to areas where expertise was needed. Frida, the former teacher, began helping with English instruction for prisoners who struggled with the language. Greta, the meteorologist, was assigned to clerical work in the camp administration, filing reports and organizing records. Ilse remained in the gardens. She liked the physical work, the visible progress, the way plants responded to proper care regardless of nationality or politics. By October, the gardens were transitioning toward winter. Caldwell taught them how to prepare beds for frost, which vegetables could overwinter, how to protect perennials from hard freezes. The work had rhythm, seasonal progression, a sense of continuity beyond the immediate moment. Ilse found herself thinking about spring, about what would be planted in March, about whether she'd still be here to see tulips bloom, or if repatriation would happen before then. During a mid-afternoon break in late October, Caldwell poured tea from his thermos into the dented mug and handed it to Ilse. She'd become accustomed to the ritual over months of work, but this time she really looked at the mug. The dent on the left side, probably from being dropped. The faded WD stamp. The slight discoloration inside from years of tannin stains. This mug had served tea to hundreds of people, soldiers, workers, prisoners. It was utilitarian, unpretentious, functional. And yet it had become, in Ilse's mind, a symbol of something larger. The small dignities that persisted even in circumstances designed to strip dignity away. She drank, tasting sugar and milk and black tea, and handed the mug to Greta. The tea circulated through their group as always. When everyone had drunk, Caldwell collected the mug, rinsed it at the garden tap, and returned it to his shed. The ritual was complete. Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow would be. Christmas 1945 arrived with snow that turned the estate grounds white and quiet. The prisoners had been warned that Christmas would be acknowledged, but not elaborately celebrated. Resources were limited, and the war's end was too recent for festivals. But on December 24th, Wardress Flynn appeared in Dormitory C with surprising news. Chapel service this evening at 19 Hides. Attendance is optional. The chaplain will conduct in English, but German hymns will be included. Also, she held up a small package wrapped in brown paper. 1 per person. Wait until Christmas morning. The chapel service was held in the manor's former library, books removed and replaced with chairs arranged in rows. Reverend William Cooper, 62, led the service with readings from Luke and traditional carols. When he announced Stille Nacht, the German prisoners sang in their language while British soldiers hummed the melody. The sound was strange, discordant in pitch, but unified in rhythm. Enemy and captor singing the same song about silent night and holy night, and all being calm. Ilse didn't cry during the service, but her throat tightened to the point where singing became impossible. She mouthed words instead, listening to Frida's alto and Greta's soprano blending with English voices singing Silent Night. The same moment in history, experienced from opposite sides of a conflict that had killed millions. Now contained in a converted library, voices rising toward ceiling beams decorated with holly someone had gathered from the estate grounds. The packages, opened on Christmas morning, contained simple gifts: a bar of soap, a comb, thick socks, and a small tin of hard candies. Utilitarian items elevated to significance by timing and scarcity. Ilsa unwrapped the soap carefully, smelling the lavender scent, feeling the smoothness against her palms. Real soap, not the gritty substitute that had been standard for years. She set it aside to use sparingly, making it last. January 1946 brought bitter cold that made outdoor work difficult. The garden labor was suspended. Prisoners were reassigned to indoor tasks: laundry, kitchen assistance, facility maintenance. Ilsa worked in the camp kitchen for 3 weeks, peeling potatoes beside Private Webb, who sang while working and tried to teach her English phrases. Pass the salt became a game, repeated until Ilsa could say it without accent, thick enough to make Webb laugh. In February, Caldwell requested Ilsa's return to garden work for early spring preparation. They worked in the greenhouse, starting seeds in trays, preparing for planting season. The greenhouse was warm, humid, smelling of soil and green growth. Caldwell showed her how to thin seedlings, how to transplant without damaging roots, how to identify which plants were thriving and which needed more attention. During a break, Caldwell poured tea and handed Ilsa the mug. She drank, noticing that the mug had acquired a new dent since autumn. Someone had dropped it, probably Caldwell himself. But it still worked. Still held liquid. Still served its purpose despite damage. She found herself thinking of the mug as metaphor. Dented but functional, damaged but useful, imperfect but sufficient. March brought repatriation planning. Red Cross officials arrived to process paperwork, verify identities, arrange transport schedules. Ilsa's group was scheduled for mid-April. She had 6 weeks to decide whether she actually wanted to return to Hamburg, to ruins and hunger, and a mother who needed her, or whether staying in England, in a camp that provided food and shelter and predictable structure, might be preferable. The choice was made by obligation, rather than desire, exactly as it had been for Margaret in the other camp. Family required her presence. Staying would be abandonment. Whatever personal preference existed became irrelevant against duty. On her last day of work, April 10th, 1946, Caldwell called Ilsa into his shed. He'd wrapped something in newspaper. Bulbs, tulip bulbs, saved from autumn planting. For your mother's garden, he said through gestures and the few German words he'd picked up. Plant in autumn, bloom in spring. Remember England? Ilsa took the package carefully, feeling the bulb's weight and the care in Caldwell's wrapping. She tried to thank him in English, managing, "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Very kind." He waved off the gratitude, uncomfortable with sentiment, and returned to organizing tools. That evening, Wardress Flynn gave Ilsa a small parcel. Inside was the tin mug, not Caldwell's, but an identical one, probably from military surplus. "Thought you might want this," Flynn said. "For tea at home. Reminder that people are complicated." Ilsa held the mug, feeling the rolled rim and the slight weight of dented metal. She couldn't speak, throat too tight. Flynn patted her shoulder awkwardly and left. The journey home took 3 days. Truck to Dover, ferry to Calais, train through devastated landscape toward Hamburg. Ilsa carried her cloth bag with letters, the bulbs, and the mug wrapped in her spare shirt for protection. She drank water from the mug during the train journey, tilting it carefully to avoid spilling. Other passengers, mostly Germans returning from various exiles and captivities, glanced at the British military mug, but said nothing. The war had made everyone's possessions strange and mismatched. Hamburg was worse than letters had described. Entire districts gone, replaced by rubble fields that stretched to horizons. Her mother's address led to a half-destroyed building where 8 families shared space that had housed one before the war. Her mother looked ancient, aged 20 years and 3, but she wept when she saw Ilsa, holding her daughter with strength that seemed impossible from such frail arms. Decades later, in a rebuilt Hamburg that bore little resemblance to the city Ilsa remembered, she kept the tin mug on her kitchen windowsill. It held pencils now, utilitarian object repurposed for domestic life. The dents had multiplied over years of use. The WD stamp had faded almost to invisibility. But it remained functional, this small piece of military surplus that had crossed the channel in her bag. Her grandson, 11 and curious about everything, asked about it one morning while Ilse made tea. "Oma, why do you keep that old mug? It's all beat up." Ilse took a newer mug from the cabinet, filled it with hot water, added a tea bag, and set it on the counter to steep. Then she picked up the tin mug, ran her thumb over the dents. "This is from England. A British soldier gave it to me after the war. But weren't they our enemies?" "Yes," Ilse said. "They were." "Then why?" "Because he chose to," Ilse interrupted gently. "Because people are always more complicated than the stories we tell about them. Because kindness doesn't require friendship, only humanity. Before you go, subscribe. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember and why." The mug returned to the windowsill, nestled among pencils and the morning light. Ilse drank her tea, looking out at the street where people walked and cars passed, and life continued in its ordinary complexity. The war had ended 40 years ago, but its lessons persisted in small objects that refused to be forgotten. The mug, dented and stained and perfectly ordinary, testified to a truth more powerful than propaganda. Civilization is choosing restraint when cruelty is easier. Humanity is offering water to an enemy who expects execution. Dignity is recognizing that the person across the wire, enemy, prisoner, threat, is first and finally a person. The measure of a nation isn't found in its weapons or its victories. It's found in how it treats the people it has every right to destroy but chooses not to. It's found in tin mugs filled with tea, offered without ceremony to women who expected death. It's found in gardens maintained through winter so spring can arrive for everyone, victors and defeated alike. Sometimes civilization is just that simple. A mug, a moment, a choice to be decent when no one's watching and nothing requires it except the stubborn insistence that humanity means something, even in war. Especially in war.